The first rays of dawn stretched across the rolling hills of Griffith Park, draping the grass in threads of gold and soft gray. The air carried the tang of eucalyptus, sharp and sweet, mingling with the distant hum of early Los Angeles traffic. Beneath an ancient oak tree, where the roots twisted like the veins of some forgotten giant, a faded towel was spread across the ground. It looked like a makeshift stage, and at its center, Valerie Spears performed her daily miracle. She was 27, but in that moment she wore the timeless face of every mother who had ever tried to turn nothing into something. Her blonde hair, hastily tied into a knot, gleamed in the slanted sunlight as she set out the meal. 6 stale saltine crackers, half an inch of tap water poured carefully into a plastic bottle cap, and 3 empty paper plates she had flattened to look like fine china. She handled them as though they were treasure's delicate relics instead of scraps. Across from her, Candace sat cross-legged, a crown of golden curls haloing her face. She was 5 years old, still in the stage where wonder outweighed want, where the world was as big as her mother's imagination. Valerie leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with the kind of determination born of desperation. "Welcome, madam," she said with the solemnity of a maître d' at the finest restaurant in the city, "to the most exclusive dining experience in all of Los Angeles." Candace clapped her hands together, eyes wide, believing every word. Her mother's voice carried authority, confidence, and a mischievous charm that transformed their meager offering into a royal banquet. Valerie placed a cracker onto the empty plate before her daughter with a flourish, as though she were unveiling an entree worthy of kings. Candace's delighted giggle broke through the morning silence, and Valerie's heart swelled with equal parts joy and ache. Her hands trembled faintly as she poured a drop of water into a plastic cup. She masked the shake with a smile, her voice never wavering. "A fine vintage from the rarest spring in the city," she said. And for the main course, crispy, golden biscuits, Candace lifted a cracker and nibbled, eyes dancing. For her, this was adventure. For Valerie, it was survival disguised as magic. Not far from the oak tree, the rhythmic thud of running shoes broke the stillness of the park trails. Elliot Tingley, 34, CEO of Tingley Corporation, ran not for health or passion but to escape. Escape from boardrooms, empty champagne flutes, and conversations that echoed but never touched him. He moved with mechanical precision, the kind of discipline bred into him by years of striving for goals that brought no peace. But then, as he rounded the bend near the oak, his pace faltered. He slowed, chest heaving, his sharp eyes locking onto the tableau beneath the tree. A mother and daughter, framed by sunlight, engaged in what looked like a game, but felt like something more profound. The towels, the empty plates, the cracked crackers handled with reverence he froze in place, as though tethered by invisible cords. Elliot watched, transfixed, as Valerie bowed with exaggerated grace, presenting her daughter with another cracker. Her laughter rose into the air, fragile and fierce, cutting through the dull roar of the city beyond the park. He had never seen anything like it. Love so raw it turned scarcity into abundance, poverty into play. In his world, tables sagged under the weight of food nobody finished. Yet here, with nothing but stale crackers, this woman conjured a feast fit for royalty. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir inside him, an ache, an envy, a longing he could not name. He stayed in the shadows of the trail, heart-pounding, afraid to move, afraid to intrude. All he could do was watch, powerless, as the curtain rose on a scene that would etch itself forever into the quiet chambers of his memory. And as the sun climbed higher, gilding the oak branches and illuminating the fragile banquet, Elliot Tingley, the man who thought he owned the world, stood frozen in place, realizing he had never truly seen it at all. The apartment was still wrapped in half-light when Valerie Spears stirred awake. Thin curtains hung tiredly across the window, letting in strips of dawn that crawled over the linoleum floor in long, pale fingers. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, low and constant, like a reminder she couldn't silence. She pushed herself upright, muscles aching from too many shifts and a little sleep. For a moment she simply stood there, staring into the shadows, as if her body needed convincing that this day was worth rising into. She padded barefoot to the window and pressed her fingertips against the cool glass. Outside, East Los Angeles began its restless shuffle. Trash trucks growled in the distance. A dog barked, and the city woke without ceremony. Inside, she was the ghost in her own life, her reflection faint against the pane, pale skin, hair pulled into an unkempt knot, the faint shadows beneath eyes that once had shone bright with hope dot behind her. A small voice murmured in sleep, Candace lay curled in the narrow bed they shared, a tangle of golden curls spilling across the pillow like sunlight trapped in fabric. Valerie's chest tightened as she watched her daughter stir, the peace on that little face cutting deep. That peace was fragile, balanced precariously on the stories Valerie spun, the illusion she crafted to keep hunger from becoming despair. 3 hours. That's all she had before Candace woke fully, expecting the picnic she had been promised. A picnic Valerie had dreamed up weeks ago to keep her daughter's smile alive, though her wallet held nothing but faded receipts. 3 hours to figure out how to turn 6 saltine crackers and half a jar of peanut butter into something resembling adventure. Asterisk, she opened the refrigerator again, though she knew exactly what she'd find. The dim interior light flickered over its barren shelves. Peanut butter, crackers, water. It felt like mockery, the universe reminding her of her smallness. She closed the door with a soft push and leaned her forehead against its cold metal, eyes closed. "Mommy," Candace's voice drifted through the air, still honey-thick with sleep. Valerie spun around quickly, her tired face rearranged into something bright. "Yes, baby girl," she said gently. The child sat up, blinking, her nightgown sliding down one shoulder. Her eyes blue like the heart of a flame gleamed with excitement. "Is today our picnic day?" Valerie swallowed the lump in her throat. For a heartbeat, the weight of her reality pressed down, threatening to crush the life she had built. Then, with the practiced grace of someone who had long mastered pretending, she nodded. "Yes, today is our adventure day." Candace leapt from the bed, her nightgown trailing behind her like a wedding dress in miniature. She twirled once, giggling. "Will there be sandwiches? Maybe cookies?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says picnics always have cookies." Valerie forced her lips into a smile, her voice steady though her chest ached. "We'll have everything we need," she said, though her mind reeled with the knowledge of how little they had. Miles away, in a penthouse that touched the skyline, Elliot Tingley woke to silence of a different kind. His bedroom, cavernous and sleek, glowed with the faint hum of automation, blinds that shifted soundlessly, lights that brightened at the wave of his hand. He lay in the king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, the sheets cool and empty beside him. At 34, Elliot owned nearly everything money could buy. The corporations bowed at his name, his calendar filled with meetings, dinners, and the endless churn of success. Yet the silence of his home gnawed at him. His phone buzzed with reminders, investor calls, media interviews, board reviews, but none of it held meaning. The night before, he had stood in a banquet hall, surrounded by glittering glasses, polished laughter, and 100 people eager to impress him. The tables groaned under the weight of food dishes so decadent he couldn't name them all. Yet he hadn't eaten a bite. Surrounded by abundance, he had felt only hunger and emptiness that wealth could never fill. Now, as he laced his running shoes, he told himself the morning jog was habit, a discipline. But the truth was simpler, darker. He ran because stillness frightened him. Stillness forced him to face the hollowness inside. By the time Elliot's feet hit the trails of Griffith Park, Valerie was already packing the worn towel into her bag, rehearsing lines in her mind. She had decided the crackers would be biscuits, the peanut butter would be a secret royal recipe, and the empty plates would hold invisible feasts. She had played this game before, but today felt heavier. As though some unseen audience waited for her performance, Elliot's jog slowed as he rounded a bend. Near the oak tree, his breath visible in the crisp air, he caught sight of a young woman kneeling on the grass, ranging what looked like nothing. But as she lifted her face toward her daughter and smiled bright, unwavering, defiant against reality, something inside him jolted. He froze, sneakers rooted to the dirt trail. For reasons he couldn't name, he couldn't look away. What he saw wasn't just a mother and daughter sharing a game. It was survival cloaked in theater, dignity dressed in illusion. It was the rawest act of love he had ever witnessed, and it shook him to his core. And though Valerie could not see him, though she had no idea her quiet performance had an audience, Elliot stood there, breathless, knowing instinctively that this moment, this fragile, heartbreaking banquet was going to change his life forever. The sun had fully breached the horizon when Elliot finally broke from his frozen stance. He had been standing there too long, sweat cooling on his skin, heart pounding not from exertion, but from the weight of what he had witnessed. He told himself to keep jogging, to let the scene pass, but his feet betrayed him. Almost without conscious thought, he stepped off the trail and moved toward the oak tree. Valerie didn't notice him at first. She was to focus on Candace, carefully pretending to slice the air with a plastic knife. describing an invisible roast that smelled, if you believe her words, of herbs and butter. Candace squealed in delight, clapping as her mother served her a slice onto the empty plate. For Valerie, it was a desperate attempt to preserve magic. For Elliot, watching from the edge, it was theater more moving than anything staged in the grandest of halls. "Excuse me," Elliot said at last, his voice low, almost hesitant. Valerie stiffened, her head snapping up. Her eyes narrowed slightly, reading him in an instant. Jogger, expensive shoes, but dusty from the trail. His t-shirt was plain, but fitted, the kind of plainness that costs money. His hair was damp with sweat, his jawline sharp, his gaze searching. She instinctively shifted her body closer to Candace, shielding the child without making it obvious. "Yes," her tone was polite, but edged with caution. "I didn't mean to intrude," Elliot said, lifting his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. I heard the laughter, and saw." He faltered, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding like a voyeur. Valerie offered him nothing, just silence. Her eyes, pale blue and piercing, held his for a long moment. Elliot felt stripped bare under her gaze. This was not a woman accustomed to indulgence. This was someone who measured people quickly, who had no time for pretenses. Candace, on the other hand, peered up at him with unfiltered curiosity. "Are you here for the picnic?" she asked brightly. Elliot blinked, startled by the question. He managed a small smile. "If I'm invited," he said softly. Candace giggled, delighted by his answer. Valerie, however, pressed her lips together, her jaw tightening. She had spent weeks crafting this fragile fantasy for her daughter. The presence of a stranger threatened to unravel it, to expose the truth she worked so hard to disguise. Still, something in Elliot's expression disarmed her. There was no pity in his eyes, no mockery, just something raw, something she couldn't quite place. Loneliness, maybe, recognition. "You don't look like the kind of man who eats picnics in parks," Valerie said finally, her voice cool. Testing, Elliot tilted his head, caught between honesty and concealment. He thought of the penthouse with its sterile marble counters, the banquets with their untouched plates. He thought of how he had stood frozen on the trail, unable to move because her performance had cracked something inside him. "Maybe I've been eating in the wrong places," he said quietly. The words hung there, simple but weighted. Valerie's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she looked away. She tore a cracker in half and set it gently onto Candace's plate. "We don't have much," she said, "but my daughter believes we have enough. That's all that matters." Elliot's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her how extraordinary that was, how rare. He wanted to confess that her act of love had shaken him to his core. But he stayed silent, afraid too much truth soon would shatter this fragile connection. Candace munched happily on her cracker, swinging her legs, oblivious to the silent current between her mother and the stranger. Then she leaned forward, whispering loudly, "Mommy, can he sit with us?" Valerie hesitated, pride warred with exhaustion, suspicion with kindness. A part of her wanted to say no, to protect the bubble she had created for her daughter. But another part, the quieter, lonelier part, remembered what it was like to share laughter with another adult. She glanced at Elliot again. Something in his eyes, something unguarded, made her nod. "Just for a little while," she said. Elliot lowered himself onto the towel, careful to keep his distance, as though afraid any sudden move might spook them. For the first time in years, he felt awkward, unsure of his role. Here, his money, his status, his polished charm meant nothing. He was just a man sitting at an empty banquet, watching a woman spin magic from scraps. As Candace offered him half a cracker, giggling, Elliot accepted it with reverence, as though it were a gift beyond price. He caught Valerie watching him, her gaze sharp, measuring. He didn't look away, and in that suspended moment, under the spreading oak branches, Elliot realized he was walking a tightrope. One wrong word, one slip of truth, and the fragile trust she allowed him would vanish. He had stepped into her world, a world held together by love and illusion, and he would have to earn the right to remain there. What he didn't know was that Valerie had already guessed something about him, something off. Joggers didn't carry themselves with that quiet command, that subtle polish. Whoever he wasn't just another man on a morning run, and that suspicion, buried deep in her chest, would one day be the spark that tore everything open. The afternoon sun slanted through the slats of the blinds, cutting Valerie's small apartment into stripes of light and shadow. She sat at the chipped kitchen table, fingers curled around a stack of unopened envelopes. Each one was heavier than paper should be. Rent past due. Utilities overdue. Final notice stamped in harsh red across the front. She didn't need to open them to know what they said. She could feel the weight of their threats. Pressing into her bones dot from the other room, Candace hummed softly, playing with a doll fashioned from scraps of fabric. Valerie closed her eyes at the sound, her chest clenching. She wanted that melody to last forever, wanted her daughter's laughter to remain untouched by the harsh edges of life. But laughter couldn't pay bills, and illusions couldn't keep the lights on. Her mind turned to the man in the park, the jogger, the stranger who didn't quite fit. His words still lingered in her ears. Maybe I've been eating in the wrong places. Who said things like that? He hadn't seemed dangerous, but he hadn't seemed ordinary either. Valerie shook the thought away, scolding herself. Daydreaming about strangers was a luxury she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, in a corner office perched high above downtown Los Angeles, Elliot Tingley stared out of floor-to-ceiling glass at the city sprawling beneath him. The skyline glittered like a cage of diamonds, but he felt no ownership over it. His assistant rattled off figures, contracts, merger details, but the words washed over him like static. He wasn't listening. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, Valerie, kneeling beneath the oak tree, conjuring a banquet out of air, fierce in her dignity, and Candace, eyes alight with belief, devouring a cracker as though it were a delicacy. That image clung to him like a fever. He should have let it go. He should have dismissed it as a passing scene, a curiosity, but he couldn't. It had cracked something inside him, a hunger, a need, a recognition he didn't want to name. That evening, he found himself driving through East Los Angeles, past blocks he had only ever glimpsed from a distance. His sleek black car looked out of place, predatory against the worn asphalt and sagging apartment buildings. He told himself he was only curious, only restless, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel as though staring against his own conscience. And then, he saw her. Through a second-story window, he glimpsed Valerie bending over a sink, sleeves rolled up, her hair falling loose. She moved with exhaustion, but even in that tiredness there was something regal about her. She didn't know he was there. Didn't know the CEO of the company where she scrubbed floors was watching from the shadows of the street. Elliot drove away quickly, shame burning in his chest. But the vision stayed with him. The next week brought strange turns. Valerie arrived at work late night cleaning shifts in the glossy offices of Tingley Corporation to find that her hours had quietly increased. More shifts meant more pay. When she asked the manager why, he only shrugged. Scheduling change, he said. She didn't press further, though suspicion gnawed at her at the end of her shift. She discovered a small brown bag left near the janitorial closet. Inside, a loaf of bread, a handful of apples, 2 cans of soup. No note, no explanation. Valerie froze, staring at the bag. Her pride bristled. Charity was a knife she couldn't bear. But the thought of Candace's eager eyes, her question about cookies, tipped the scale. She carried the bag home in silence, jaw clenched tight. That night, as she sliced the bread into thin pieces, Candace's face lit up as though it were a feast. "Mommy, it's like the park picnic," she said. Valerie smiled, but inside, unease spread like inky water. Elliot sat in his penthouse, watching the city glow beneath him, untouched plates of catered food on the counter. He told himself he wasn't interfering, that he was only easing a burden, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. It wasn't pity that drove him, it was need. The need to feel tethered to something real. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth. If Valerie knew who he was, she would recoil. He had seen it in her eyes that morning, the pride, the steel. She would never forgive a man like him for trespassing into her world with money. So he stayed in the shadows, arranging small mercies like secret offerings. But shadows have a way of stretching, and already suspicion was creeping into Valerie's heart. One night, after a double shift, Valerie returned home to find another bag waiting by her door. This time, it wasn't just food. Nestled among the groceries was a stuffed rabbit, soft and new, with a pink ribbon around its neck. She froze, her breath caught, her pulse hammering in her ears. Food was one thing, food she could rationalize, however uneasily. But a toy, a gift for her daughter, that was different. That was personal. Candace's eyes lit up the moment she saw it. She scooped the rabbit into her arms, hugging it close. "Look, Mommy, for me?" Valerie's stomach twisted. Who knew where she lived? Who was leaving these things? Her gaze darted to the darkened hallway, the silence pressing in. She forced a smile for Candace's sake, but her insides were a storm. That night, long after her daughter had fallen asleep with the rabbit clutched to her chest, Valerie sat at the window, staring out into the street. Shadows shifted, cars passed, and every flicker made her pulse jump. She didn't know it was Elliot who had placed the gift. She didn't know the man from the park, the stranger who had shared a cracker, was weaving threads around her life, but she felt it, an invisible presence pressing closer. And for the first time, the magic she had spun for her daughter began to tremble at its edges. Asterisk, the stuffed rabbit, sat perched on Candace's pillow like a sentinel, its pink ribbon catching the lamplight. Candace had named it Rosie, and from the moment she received it, the toy became her constant companion. She carried it tucked under her arm to the bus stop, balanced it on her lap during dinner, even whispered secrets into its stitched ears before bed. Valerie, however, couldn't look at Rosie without her stomach tightening. Every glimpse of the toy felt like a reminder. Someone new. Someone had entered her life uninvited. She washed the dishes with mechanical rhythm, eyes flicking to the door as if expecting another bag to appear. Another intrusion wrapped as kindness. By the end of the week, her nerves were frayed. She found another sack at her door, this time filled with more groceries, fresh fruit, and even a package of chocolate chip cookies. She froze, one hand hovering above the bag. The sweetness of the gesture might have soothed another woman, but to Valerie it was acid. Cookies. The very thing her daughter had wished for aloud. Whoever was leaving these things wasn't just guessing, they were listening, watching. She dragged the bag inside reluctantly. Candace squealed with joy when she saw the cookies, clapping her hands. See, Mommy, Mrs. Rodriguez was right. Picnics do have cookies. She hugged Valerie's waist, beaming. We're so lucky. Valerie forced a smile, but inside her thoughts churned. Lucky wasn't the word. Targeted, trapped, exposed. That was closer to the truth. That night, after Candace fell asleep with crumbs still dusting her lips, Valerie sat alone in the dark, the unopened bills scattered before her. Her pride screamed at her to reject these offerings, to toss the bags away, to march into the night and demand answers from the shadows. But another voice, quieter and crueler, whispered, without them, what then? Without them, Candace starves. The battle inside her twisted like wire around her ribs. She hated herself for even considering it, for leaning however unwillingly on the faceless benefactor who refused to step forward. In another world high above the city, Elliot Tingley sat in his penthouse, head in his hands. He had never been a man prone to hesitation, but now hesitation defined him. Every day, he arranged another delivery, another small mercy disguised as coincidence. And every day, his guilt deepened. He wanted to tell her the truth, that it was him, the stranger from the park, the man she cleaned offices for while the city slept. But fear anchored him. Fear that she would see his gestures as condescension, as pity, rather than the desperate offering of a man trying to bridge the unbridgeable. His life had never prepared him for this. Boardrooms had taught him how to outmaneuver rivals, not how to win the trust of a woman who despised pity more than hunger. He could sign contracts worth billions, but he couldn't find the words to tell Valerie why he had frozen under that oak tree. So he remained silent, and in his silence, suspicion grew like a shadow between them. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Valerie woke to find Candace already dressed, clutching Rosie and tugging at her hand. Let's go to the park again, Mommy, Candace begged. Maybe we can have another feast. Maybe there will be cookies again. Valeria's throat tightened. She didn't want to return to that oak tree, not when she couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the trail. But Candace's smile was radiant, pleading, and Valerie could no more deny her that she could stop breathing. They walked the familiar path, towel folded under Valeria's arm, crackers tucked into her bag. The park was bright, filled with joggers, couples, families. Yet Valeria's every sense strained for danger, scanning faces, watching shadows. When they reached the oak, she spread the towel and tried to smile, but the illusion faltered. Her movements were stiffer, her laughter thinner. Candace noticed, frowning slightly. What's wrong, Mommy? Valerie shook her head quickly. Nothing, baby, just tired. But the truth pressed on her chest. She couldn't keep up the game forever. And then she saw him, Asterisk Elliot, standing at the edge of the trail, as if fate had summoned him. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, Valerie saw recognition flash between them, not the polite curiosity of a stranger, but the spark of someone who knew far too much. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't chance. He was the one. Candace spotted him and squealed. "It's the man from before. Mommy, look, it's our picnic friend." She waved enthusiastically, innocent joy bubbling out of her. Valeria's blood ran cold. She pressed her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, forcing her to sit. Her gaze never left Elliot. He approached slowly, careful, as though crossing sacred ground. Every step he took made Valeria's heart pound louder. She wanted to scream at him to leave, to demand why he had wormed his way into her life. But Candace's wide, hopeful eyes held her tongue. Elliot stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." The words were simple, but they set fire to the air. Valeria's jaw tightened. "Like what?" Her voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. "Like me being here. Again. Like." He trailed off, guilt flickering across his face. Candace blinked between them, clutching Rosie. "Mommy, why are you mad? He's nice. He brought cookies." Valeria's breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt. Candace couldn't know, but the words confirmed her worst fear. Elliot's silence, his careful distance, had shattered Dot, and now there was no turning back. The silence beneath the oak tree thickened, pressing like a storm about to break. Candace still sat cross-legged on the faded towel, her rabbit Rosie clutched tight against her chest, her face bright with expectation. But the air between her mother and Elliot was sharp, dangerous, humming with unspoken truths. Valerie rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her gaze locked on him. She stood tall, though exhaustion and fear pressed down on her like lead. "What did you mean?" she demanded, her voice low, trembling with restrained fire. "What didn't you mean to happen?" Elliot swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had faced boardrooms filled with predators, negotiated with men twice his age who kill empires with a pen stroke. None of it compared to this moment, to this woman staring him down, demanding answers with nothing but her eyes. "I didn't want to intrude," he said carefully, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't want you to feel." "Feel what?" Valerie cut him off, watched, pitied. "Because that's exactly how I feel right now." Candace glanced between them, confusion knitting her brow. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging lightly at Valeria's skirt. But Valerie didn't move, didn't break her stare. Elliot shifted, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He hadn't planned this moment. He had wanted to build trust slowly, to reveal himself in fragments, in ways she could accept. But fate had stripped away his control. The truth was here, and he had nowhere left to hide. "It was you, wasn't it?" Valeria's voice cracked, though her eyes burned with fury. "The bags, the food." She broke off, glancing at Rosie in her daughter's arms. Her voice lowered, trembling. "The toy," Elliot said nothing, but his silence screamed the answer. Valeria's hands curled into fists. "Do you think I don't see what this is? Do you think I don't know charity when it's shoved onto my doorstep like scraps? Do you think I'm some pathetic project for you to fix?" Her words cut through him like glass. He flinched, but didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice breaking with urgency. "It wasn't charity. Then what was it?" She snapped. "Because from where I stand, it looks exactly like pity wrapped in grocery bags." Elliot's chest tightened, his voice rising despite himself. "It was admiration. It was respect. That morning, when I saw you." He broke off, shaking his head, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "You took 6 crackers and nothing else, and you turned it into magic. You protected her from seeing hunger. I couldn't walk away from that. I've seen people with everything destroy their children with neglect. But you," his voice cracked, "you gave her the world with nothing." Valerie faltered, just slightly, but her jaw clenched again. "You had no right." "I know," Elliot admitted. His voice dropped, raw and unguarded. "I know, but I couldn't forget it. I couldn't forget you." For a long moment, only Candace's small voice filled the silence. She whispered into Rosie's ear, rocking the rabbit back and forth, trying to block out the sharpness of their tones. Valerie exhaled shakily, her eyes narrowing again. "Who are you?" The question landed like a hammer. Elliot hesitated, his silence stretching to long, and in that silence the truth began to dawn on her. She remembered the polished plainness of his clothes, the command in his voice even when he tried to hide it. She remembered the nights cleaning the glass offices of Tingley Corporation, the whispers of a young CEO who built empires with the sweep of his hand. Her stomach dropped. No, the word was barely audible, a breath of disbelief. She shook her head once, then again, harder. You're not just some jogger. Elliot's eyes darkened, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally spoke. I'm Elliot. Elliot Tingley. The name hung in the air like a guillotine. Valerie staggered back a step, as though struck. Her laugh was bitter, hollow. Of course you are. Her voice rose, trembling with fury. Of all the cruel jokes the universe could play, Candace's wide eyes blinked up at her. Mommy, Valeria's voice shook, rage spilling past the edges of her control. You, the man whose name is on the checks I cash when I scrub your offices until my hands bleed. The man whose world sits in glass towers while people like me break their backs to keep it shining. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her jaw stayed iron. And now you're what's lumming in the park, handing out toys and cookies to make yourself feel human again? Elliot's face contorted, pained. He reached out instinctively, but Valerie recoiled. It wasn't like that. He whispered. It isn't like that. Then tell me what it is. She spat. Tell me why a millionaire CEO was watching me pretend to feed my child with empty plates. Tell me why you've been creeping into my life like a ghost I never asked for. The words struck him like blows, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he let his voice break open, unguarded, desperate. Because I've had everything and felt nothing. Because I've eaten at the finest tables in the world and starved every night. Because when I saw you, I saw love, real love, not bought or bargained or signed into contracts. You were giving her something I didn't even know existed. Valerie shook her head, tears slipping free. She wanted to scream, to curse, to push him away forever. But beneath the fury, beneath the betrayal, something dangerous flickered, an echo of truth in his words. A mirror of the emptiness she saw in his eyes. She turned away sharply, wiping her cheeks, her body trembling. Candace clutched her rabbit tighter, her small voice fragile. Mommy, don't be sad. Valerie gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her close, her gaze never leaving Elliot. Her voice, when it came, was low and trembling with rage and grief. You should have stayed away. Elliot stood there, motionless, as Valerie lifted her daughter and walked away from the oak tree. Her figure strong even in retreat. The space where she had stood felt hollow, stripped bare. Elliot dropped to the towel, staring at the crumbs of crackers left behind, the ghost of their banquet lingering. He pressed his hands against his face, the weight of everything crushing him. For the first time in his life, Elliot Tingley had no idea how to fix what was broken. The days after the confrontation bled together like bruises. Valerie moved through them on autopilot, cleaning offices at night, clutching Candace during the day, shutting her blinds tight as though the world outside my closet's weighing. She told herself she wanted nothing to do with him, Elliot Tingley, the man who had broken into her life with secrets and shadows. Yet his presence lingered like a ghost, pressing against her every thought. Candace asked about him more than once. Where's the picnic man, Mommy? She would say, Rosie clutched tight against her chest. Valerie forced her voice steady as she replied, He's not coming back. Each time she said it, something in her cracked. Meanwhile, high above the city, Elliot sat in his penthouse, stripped of the armor that had always defined him. Meetings passed without focus. Investors noticed his silence, and for the first time, Elliot Tingley, the man who had built an empire, had no taste for victory. He thought only of the oak tree, of the woman who had looked at him not with awe or desire, but with fury. A woman who had seen him as a man, stripped of his empire, and found him wanting, for days. He didn't send groceries. He didn't drive past her apartment. He stayed away, fighting the instinct to force himself back into her orbit. But the distance only sharpened the ache, and eventually, he understood the only way forward was not with money, or gifts, or gestures hidden in shadows. It had to be something real, something that proved he wasn't buying his way into her world. He was willing to kneel in it. It was a week later when Valerie woke to find Candace tugging at her hand with unusual urgency. Mommy, please, can we go back to the park today? Rosie misses the oak tree. Her daughter's insistence was so earnest, so pure, that Valerie couldn't bring herself to say no. They boarded the bus, the city rolling past in tired colors, and made their way back to Griffith Park. The morning was clear, the air crisp, the trails alive with joggers and families. Valerie spread the faded towel beneath the oak once more, laying out their meager offering, crackers and water. She tried to smile, tried to breathe, but her chest was heavy, and then she froze. Someone was already there. Elliot stood beneath the oak tree, not in his usual running clothes, but in plain jeans and a shirt rolled at the sleeves. At his feet was no lavish spread, no glittering display of wealth. Instead, a simple wicker basket sat open, filled with food, sandwiches, fruit, even a small thermos of cocoa. But what caught Valeria's breath was not the food. It was Elliot himself. He wasn't standing tall, commanding. He was kneeling, carefully setting the plates, real plates, ceramic but chipped, onto the towel as though preparing for an ordinary meal. When he saw them, he didn't speak right away. He simply looked at Valerie, his expression stripped bare, vulnerable. And then, softly, he said, "I wanted to do this right. No shadows, no secrets, just us." Candace squealed with delight, running forward to peer into the basket. "Mommy, look, real sandwiches." She clapped her hands. "And cookies." Rosie said there would be cookies. Valerie stood rooted to the spot, torn between fury and something far more dangerous. The flicker of longing. Her eyes narrowed. "You think this makes up for everything?" Elliot shook his head quickly. "No, nothing makes up for the lies. Nothing makes up for me hiding who I was. But I needed you to know. I'm not here as the CEO. I'm not here as Tingley Corporation. I'm here as Elliot, a man who hasn't felt alive in years until he saw you." Her chest constricted, her pride warring with the pull of his words. She wanted to shout at him, to turn and leave, but Candace tugged at her hand, her blue eyes wide, her small voice breaking through the storm. "Mommy, please, can we just have the picnic? Just this one?" Valerie looked down at her daughter, then back at Elliot. She exhaled slowly, the weight of her choices pressing on her. Finally, with deliberate steps, she lowered herself onto the towel beside Candace. Elliot's relief was visible in the way his shoulders dropped. He sat too, careful not to crowd her, and passed a plate toward Candace. The little girl laughed as she bit into a sandwich, swinging her legs. Oblivious to the weight pressing on the adults around her, Valerie didn't touch the food at first. She simply stared at Elliot, her voice low and steady. "If you ever pity me again, I'll walk away and never look back." Elliot met her eyes, unflinching. "I don't pity you. I envy you." His voice broke, raw. "You gave her more love with 6 crackers than I've seen in a lifetime of banquets." The words hung heavy between them for a long moment. The only sound was Candace humming softly to Rosie, the sound of a child content in the magic of the moment. And slowly, cautiously, Valerie reached for a sandwich. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't surrender. But it was something. The oak tree became their table that morning. Not gilded with fantasy, but anchored in something real. No longer empty plates and invisible feasts, no longer secrets hidden in shadows. Just a man, a woman, and a child sharing food under the sky. And as Valerie watched Candace's laughter echo through the park, she realized with a jolt of shock that frightened her as much as it comforted her. Perhaps the most exclusive restaurant in Los Angeles had never been about the food, or the gifts, or the man's name. Perhaps it was about love. And perhaps, against all odds, she was not as alone as she had always believed.